Today's Bible reading takes place during the reign of Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Ahab has turned from Yahweh, the God of his ancestors, to the worship of Baal, the god of his wife and her people. So Yahweh raises up the prophet Elijah and tells him to prophesy a drought, which then unfolds. Yahweh tells Elijah to hide himself away from the city where ravens bring him food, and water comes from a nearby wadi, which is like an arroyo. But as the drought continues, even the wadi dries up, and the story continues with today's reading. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Go now to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and live there, for I have commanded a widow there to feed you." So he set out and went to Zarephath. When he came to the gate of the town, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and said, "Bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink." As she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, "Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." But she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked and only a handful of meal in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am now gathering a couple of sticks so that I may go home and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. And afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the jar of meal will not be emptied, and the jug of oil will not fail, until the day the Lord sends rain to the earth." So she went and did as Elijah said, so that she, as well as he and her household, ate for many days. The jar of meal was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. May these words be to us our light and our life. Thanks be to God. As I was pondering that text, I couldn't help but remember a story that my father-in-law, Edward Slettom, told to me. He grew up on a farm in Little Falls, and his parents and his 4 siblings were there. And this was during the Depression years in the 30s, and it didn't matter if you were on a farm, you still had difficulty putting food on the table. One day, a young boy from a neighboring farm was visiting, and because it was getting around dinner time, he was invited to eat with the family. Ed doesn't remember all of the details of how or why, but what he does remember is that when the dinner was served, the food was first offered to the boy because he was their guest, beginning with a meager platter of meat. Ed and his siblings watched in astonishment as the boy eagerly took one helping after another, leaving very little left for the other 7 people around the table. Ed remembers that his mother gave all of the kids the look. She caught their eyes one by one and silently let it be known that they were to say nothing, just share without complaint whatever was left. So that's what they did. But they couldn't help noticing how hungry the boy was and how many helpings he took of all of the dishes on the table. After dinner, while the kids cleared the table, Ma Slettom went back to the cook stove and prepared another whole dinner. And then she packed it up and she brought it to the boy's family. It was a lesson in sharing and compassion that my father-in-law never forgot. And I've been remembering the story also because, as a church, we're in a period of discernment as each of us considers how to respond to the capital campaign. It's a campaign, not a drive, because we're not driving you to anything. We're calling it a time of discernment and reflection about how best to use our personal resources and the resources of the church and the resources of the planet, because frankly they're all related, aren't they? You can't separate them out. We're calling for financial discernment at a time when we know that the recovery has still mostly benefited the 1%. So instead of invoking the usual stewardship means of Paul's cheerful giver or Jesus' life abundant, I'm going to suggest something different, a theology of enough. A theology of enough suggests a number of things. By calling it a theology, I'm suggesting that the decisions about what we spend and how much we consume, be they energy or goods, take place in a context larger than our individual desires. They take place in a relational context. And by using the word enough, I am suggesting that it is not about getting more, but about making choices about how to distribute what we have. A theology of enough is both relational and distributive. For example, if the U.S. takes more than its share of the world's energy resources, it leaves fewer resources for other countries. At the same time, if our personal choices lead us to favor some forms of consumption over others, then it stands to reason that we will have fewer resources available when a new need or desire arises. If my charitable giving goes mostly to the arts and education, then I have fewer dollars left to spend on social programs or political campaigns. The temptation is to interpret this as, if I had more, I could give more. But as the story of Slettom makes clear, and the widow in Zarephath, it's not about scarcity. There was little enough for Ma's own family. The widow had only enough for one last meal to be shared with her son before they died. The issue is deciding about what to do with what we've got, as individuals, as church members, as Americans, as dwellers on this planet. This kind of stewardship, in this broader context, really does require reflection and discernment, not just in these designated weeks, but all of the time. There is a dominant strand in American culture that considers what I'm going to say next a no-brainer. It's this: you get all you can, and you get it for yourself, and you're an idiot if you don't. But there's an older tradition. One we read about in the Bible. You benefit from your labor, but you always leave something for the gleaners, for the widows, the orphan, the strangers. And in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, we get another strand of biblical economics, a cooperative model in which all things are held in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. It says that in Acts 4:32. Really? You would probably not be surprised to learn that a lot of biblical scholars considered this a rather idealized portrait of the early church. They would sell all they had and distribute the proceeds to the poor. But whether they pulled it off or not, or whether they just wished they did, is kind of beside the point, because it distracts from the underlying message. First, that it was a goal worth striving for, and second, that the economic expenditure and distribution, those things are proper topics for theology and for church communities. Okay, I can't resist this one. There's a joke from a few years back that asked, what kind of car would the disciples have? What car would they drive? And the answer is a Honda, because according to some translations, it says that they all went about in one accord. Sorry. But the joke calls attention to a word we don't use a lot anymore, which is accord. As a noun, it means harmony or agreement. As a verb, it means to grant or bestow, generally in the sense of power, praise, recognition. What would it be like if everyone on this planet were of one accord about energy use and the distribution of wealth? What if everyone, from individuals to corporations to nations, limited themselves to their fair share? This is a pretty idealized view of the world, and maybe even more idealistic than the early church holding all things in common. But here's the actual takeaway. Those early Christians tried. And they tried it while they were surrounded by the Roman Empire, which is had a very different understanding of possessions. They didn't take on the entire Roman Empire and its monetary system. They just tried to do what was right in their own community. And apparently it was enough, however imperfectly realized. It was certainly enough to keep the fledgling church going. And in Zarephath, the widow tried. In the midst of a drought staring death in the face, she chose to honor the ancient custom of hospitality. And she trusted. She trusted the word of the Lord that there would be enough to feed not only Elijah, but her household as well. For many days, the text says, until the drought ends. Now notice that the jug and the jar didn't get any bigger. They stayed the same size, meaning that they only ever held just enough, kind of like manna, eh? Enough for the day, for the immediate need, and no more. Elijah abides there until God calls him to return to Ahab and enter a contest with the priests of Baal for rain. But that, as they say, is a story for another day, or one, figuratively speaking, that Californians are probably eager to hear. You could say that Ma Slettom did the same thing as the widow of Zarephath and the early disciples. Surely there were people better able to feed the hungry families, but she didn't wait for them to come through. She just took part of what she had and she distributed it differently, and it was enough. We live in a profligate society. In the U.S., we waste, I think, almost twice as much energy as we import. And we can sit here on the corner of Lincoln and McAllister and wait for that kumbaya moment when multinationals and Wall Street suddenly grow a conscience, or for the meal to come from someone else's jar or someone else's cook stove. We could wait for that grand accord that will feed the hungry, welcome the stranger, and save the planet. Or we could go about in our own accord, which is, in fact, what we're doing. I'm not saying we all drive Hondas, but we have commitments to the church, to the well-being of each other, to hospitality for the vulnerable, and to the flourishing of this planet. Rather than plunge into what we cannot do, I suggest we focus on what we can do. And focusing on what we cannot do is a theology of scarcity. And focusing on what we can do is a theology of enough. The first leads to worry. The second leads to prayer. We don't need to become more than what we are. What we are already is enough. It's a matter of distribution and commitment to the common good. Where do we put our time, our energy, our resources? Ma Slettom couldn't feed a hungry nation, but she could feed one hungry family. She didn't need more food in order to do it. She just needed to reallocate what she already had. On that day, in that context, for that one family, it was enough. But to make that difference, she had to do it. She had to have the will to get up from the table, cook another meal, and then take it to that family. In the same way, we don't need to be better people. We just have to be prayerful about the allocation of the goodness that is already in us. I want to say that again. We don't need to become better people. We just have to be prayerful about the allocation of the goodness that is already in us. Just because we are surrounded by an empire mentality doesn't mean we can't do what we think is right as individuals and as a church. We can't save the whole world, but we can do something. And maybe at this time, in this context, it will be enough. We don't have to wait until we are better people or have better resources. Who we are right now, what we have to offer, along with the grace of God, that is enough.